So this quarter we're starting a new book. Looks like this right here, in the days of the judges. And so if you don't have one, Kyle is ready to help you out. If you don't have one, raise your hand and he's going to try to help get you one. And also, there is this syllabus or this schedule. It's available out in the hallway, or Kyle may have some of those too, I don't know. But it'll help keep you on track. And so I'll just tell you, the thing that will help you the most in this class is if you just follow that syllabus. And it's going to tell you there'll be 3 or 4 pages to read out of this book. There'll be an overview. And then there'll be 2 or 3 chapters to read in the Bible, for each class. If you do that, you are prepared for the class. And if you do that, you will learn some things. Because if you don't make any preparation and you come to class, well, I hope there's something you can glean from that. But it won't be like you've prepared. It won't be like you have studied that ahead. So please, that's what I'm asking of you, is that you'll just follow that outline and do that reading, and you will be prepared for class. So here we are, starting, this third quarter. In the days of the judges. That's the name of the book, and it also just describes where we're going this quarter and what it's going to be about. And so we'll take a few minutes here just kind of recapping some things and kind of getting our minds up to speed on where we're going on some things. We're transitioning some. We're transitioning not only in book, we're going from Deuteronomy into Joshua, but there's also other changes taking place. And you tell me, if we talk about a transition right now, what's happening? What's happening in the story? Moses to Joshua. And so like on Wednesday night, we're talking about, and I think last Sunday, God has told Moses that you're not going any farther. You're not crossing over the Jordan. And so the book of Deuteronomy in so many ways has been this big review of their last 40 years and the communication that God has had with them. And in fact, I think really these are some of the most exciting books of the Bible. I guess it was the first Sunday that we were here. Well, we had starting working with the church. We were here just visiting with the church. And we had a little question and answer session in the afternoon. It was a stump the chump kind of a thing, the preacher, See what questions you have for him and stuff like that. And I remember so well, Willeen Mosley sitting right here. And she said, "What is your favorite book of the Bible?" And now, knowing Willeen, I know she was just hoping, expecting I would say Isaiah or Ezekiel or something like that. And what did I say? Deuteronomy. Because in Exodus, I used 2 books, because I just love the storyline of Exodus through Deuteronomy. And she tried to not act disappointed, but now I know deep inside she must have been crushed, that I didn't say Ezekiel, But I just love the storyline as it unfolds. It's just incredible. The relationship that God wants with Moses and with the children of Israel. And if I could even say, the relationship that he wants with you and me. Okay, I know we live in a different time. We live under a different law. I get that. But the relationship that he wants with us is the same. He wants to be our God. How many times has he said, "And if you keep my commandments and my statutes, I will be your God and you will be my people." It's a repeated theme all the way through the Revelation. It's said again. This is what God wants of those who would be his people. That we will listen to him. And that we will obey him, we will follow him, and we will have a relationship with him. And that comes out to me, just screams out in these books that we've just studied through. It's not going to change. It's going to continue. But there are some things now that are changing. We've loved studying about Moses. And hopefully we even feel like we know him well enough to have like a relationship with him. We know who he is. We know his people. And we know those that he was leading. We know about his relationship with God. But Moses is soon to be no more. And so that takes us right to the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And there in chapter 33, you remember these words here as Moses was speaking. And he's, I think, trying to give some encouragement now to Israel when he says to them, "Blessed are you, O Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord. He is your shield and helper and your glorious sword. Your enemies will cower before you, and you will trample down their high places." So these are words to lift them up. Knowing that he's not going over with them. God has told him, you will see the promised land. And as we try to get some things, in fact, that's what we're working on a lot today and Wednesday, is trying to get a picture and a view in our mind of what this looks like. The land, going into the promised land. And even what Moses gets to see. And we think about some of the last classes, some of the last things that have been studied some here, where, coming up near the promised land, remember how we came up, out of the wilderness through here, Mount Hor. Well, what happened at Mount Hor? You remember? What?
You said Hor?
No, what happened at Mount Hor? We lost somebody there. Might have lost all of you, I'm not sure. Aaron, yes. Aaron died there, remember? On the mountain. And so the children of Israel, they continue on taking kind of a roundabout way through Edom and Moab. And why did they go that roundabout way? Well, why was that? What's that? Well, yeah, there was that, but no, that's not what I'm looking at. Well, why didn't they just get on the King's Highway and just bounce right up through there? Yeah, the kings wouldn't let them. And so they took this roundabout way, kind of sneaking through the Arabah and through really some pretty rough ground, because they'd been told not to make war with the Moabites and with the Edomites. Why not? They could have taken them. They were kin. And God said not to go to war with your kin. Okay, so that's why they kind of worked around this other way and came around, and we're right up here right now in that Mount Nebo. And that's where God is with Moses there at Mount Nebo. And he gets this final view. You can see the plains of Moab, and there's the Jordan Valley right there before him. And from there, God gave Moses an extraordinary view. Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34. And just the first few verses there. Just get this fresh in our mind. Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali and the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah as far as the western sea. The Negev, the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. Stop right there for a second. I'm still trying to figure this out, and I don't have an answer for this. I mean, what is described to us is that from Mount Nebo that Moses can see all the way to the western sea, the Mediterranean, all the way down to the Negev, Zor, way down here, north. How did he see that far? I mean, is that literal? Well, I don't know. Could be miraculous. Did God somehow provide a means for him to see all of that, or is it somewhat figurative here? Moses could see a whole lot. Was that I don't know. We can't speculate about that. But every time I read that, I kind of wonder, I wonder what that really was. And then it goes on. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, and Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord said, and he buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. And so here's where we are, leaving Moses behind. And this is the spot. And this is the place. And so we've traveled a long way with Moses. And if we look at Mount Nebo, or we look from Mount Nebo today, this is a view from Mount Nebo, kind of looking across that Jordan Valley. Somewhere down in that lower spot over there, somewhere in here. Actually, it's the Jordan River. I can't make it out, but I know it's right in there. And if you go there today, there is this church up here on the top. I think they call it the Church of Moses. I think what it is. It's a site traditionally where some believe, well, this is the top of Nebo. This must be where he's buried, and they've built a church there, kind of a monument type thing. But as the scripture just said, nobody knows exactly where he was buried. God took care of that. But it's interesting to kind of think about that. And again, why was it? Why was it that Moses couldn't go over? He had disobeyed. In fact, chapter 32 says, now I think it's kind of an interesting little point here. The last part of chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, beginning at verse 48, on that same day the Lord told Moses, come up into the Abiram range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, and view Canaan, the land that I'm giving you to the Israelites. Not the point I'm wanting to make here. You're going to die up there. Verse 51. This is because both of you, speaking of Aaron and his brother, this is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites. Now, I don't know if the point that kind of stands out to me is that God's real serious about this. The fact that credit wasn't given to God. Must we strike this rock and bring water to you? Moses said. There was no me involved, or we involved here. It was God who was bringing the water. And he didn't give credit and glory to God. You see, and that broke faith with me is the way he says it here. And I thought that was just kind of an interesting phrase in the way that was said there. And so 120 years old Moses was when he died. It's referenced again there in chapter 34, where we've already read just a moment ago, and it was God who buried him there on top of that. We have followed with Moses a long way. What do you think about it? How do you feel at this point, kind of leaving Moses behind in the story? I'm just kind of curious. What do you think about that? How does that sit with you? There's not a right or wrong. It's just, tell me what you think. Kind of feel bad for Moses. Yeah.
After all he's done and all he obeyed, he messed up one time.
He messed up, and there was a consequence. Thing. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's like leaving behind an old friend, thing says. And I kind of feel that way. Leaving him behind, and yet we're sure going to read a lot about Moses going forward, but it's in that past tense. So the situation is changing with that here as we go forward. Verse 12 of verse 34 says, this is an interesting point. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And isn't that the truth? Who else has done the things Moses has done? And of course, when we say the things Moses has done, it was the power of God that was doing that. He had been filled with the Spirit of God, really.
We remember studying last quarter the story of Nadab and Abihu, how they were struck dead.
Yeah.
And God says of them the exact same thing he said to Moses in Deuteronomy 32:51. You did not treat me as holy before the people. And yet God dealt with Moses in a very different way than he dealt with Nadab and Abihu.
Yeah.
They didn't have anything ahead of them. They died instantly because they didn't treat God as holy. No, Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, but God dealt very gracefully and graciously with Moses. God took him, I mean, yes, he died, but he died in something of miraculous circumstances, it seems.
Sure.
And God welcomed him into eternity. And so I don't want us to feel too bad for Moses for not being able to go into the promised land.
Because we're going to come across Moses again. And in fact, even when some say, well, what happened to Moses? Well, what indication might we have that Moses is in the sight of God? Well, what indication might we have of that? A transfiguration. Remember Matthew 17? You know, when the three apostles saw with Jesus transfigured there, Moses and Elijah. You know, so that the relationship that
it's
God.
It's interesting, though, that the exact same thing is said. You did not treat me as holy.
Yeah.
That's what Nadab and Abihu did.
Right. That's
God
right.
struck them dead.
Yeah. And Israel saw that immediately, and as I recall, it kind of got their attention, you know, which perhaps as this did too. All right, really good.
Joe,
Yes.
also in Hebrews, it talks about the faithfulness of Moses.
It does. That's right too.
That's an indication that he was the prophet.
That's true too. That's a good point. You know, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, there's another interesting comment I just want to bounce on for a moment. Again, just talking a little bit about Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 15. We're stepping in here in the middle at verse Deuteronomy 18, I should be saying. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. Moses was speaking here. God's going to raise up another prophet. You know, one kind of like me. Who do you think he's talking about? What's that? Christ? Yeah, he's speaking about Jesus here. And in fact, if we look over at the book of John, a couple of passages. John chapter 5. John chapter 5. And in verse 46, it's Jesus speaking now. And is bearing witness to himself, is what he says earlier in this text. He's kind of telling some people about himself and who he is. Verse 46 says, and for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. Really? Moses wrote about Jesus? Jesus said so just now. In chapter 6, it's the next page or so, in chapter 6 and, chapter 6 and verse 14, and these men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. Kind of wonder if this is what Moses was referring to all that time earlier. And now Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm the one Moses talked about. You Jews who say you are so faithful to the law, then you should know something about the prophet who is coming. And Jesus is saying, that's me. So we have that going on there too. Let's look on here. As we prepare, Moses, we leave Moses and we prepare to cross over into the promised land. I want us to spend some time this morning and maybe sometime on Wednesday really trying to understand the land. And so at some point we're going to break away from just the storyline a little bit and let's just talk about the promised land. Because we're going to be there for a long time, as we study through. And there's some things that I think it would be helpful for us to know, because as we're reading through the Bible story, and there are different events that are happening and taking place in different locations, it's kind of nice just to know where that's at. And to have kind of an understanding of what it looks like, maybe, and some things like that. So as we get into the book of Joshua, the first thing we're going to read about is going into the promised land. And so we think for a moment where we've been here the last few weeks and months, from Egypt to Canaan, because we're about to go into Canaan right now. There was that call of Moses that took place, Exodus chapter 3. The plagues that came upon Egypt that finally brought them to a point of releasing the children of Israel. We followed the children of Israel from Egypt to Sinai. And then there was God's covenant that was made with Israel at Sinai. Then there was the covenant that was broken right after that at Sinai. And then there was the delay of staying at Sinai where a covenant was reestablished. All of that took place in just a little period of time. And then we go from Sinai up to Kadesh, remember? The 12 spies, went in to look. That didn't go so well. There was not the faith that said, yeah, we can overtake, we can go. But they were up to the lower part of Canaan. They were there. But then they turned away. And God turned them back out into the wilderness. And now we've had all these years of wilderness wandering. Now we're in the plains of Moab. And try to start imagining this 1 million or maybe 2 million people in the plains of Moab, the camps that are set up. Everything is there. They're just across the Jordan. The promised land it's right there. If you're on the mountain or even in the plain, you can look across the Jordan and it's like, it's right there. They've heard about it. This generation hasn't been this close before. And here they are, and it's right there. And then we end the story with the speeches from Moses. And so now that journey's coming to an end. They're not done journeying yet, but that portion of it is coming to an end. So now there's some, we'll just say, new beginnings. That's what's happening now. And so as the book of Joshua opens up, we find Joshua is the one who is in the lead. And he's the one that's in the lead as far as physically leading Israel. He is the one who is the main person in the storyline. He's the voice that we are going to be hearing now as he speaks to Israel. And so we're going to have this crossing over of the Jordan, literally, that takes place. And then the events at Gilgal will be one of the first stories in the new land. So that's where we are right now. And so, entering the promised land, 40 years since the Israelites left Egypt. The wilderness wandering's coming to an end. But they have to cross over. They have to camp at Gilgal. There'll be the circumcision of all the men born in the wilderness. And they'll remember the Passover on the 40th anniversary of the time they left Egypt. So all of that is about to happen. Let's talk about the land. And sometimes even I find this to be confusing, because when you talk about the land, what do you call it? Well, Canaan. That's what it was actually called, the land. It was the land of Canaan. And the earliest inhabitants there, we need to remember that there's been inhabitants there for a long time. Kind of goes back to the beginning. Some of the earliest of people. It was the son of Noah, Ham, whose descendants went to Canaan. And Ham's son, named Canaan, is where the name comes from, the land of Canaan. But it's also called, we've been talking about the promised land or the promised land. We hear it that way too, because God promised the land to the descendants of Abraham. Going back, thinking about the promise that God made to Abraham, Genesis 12, here we are. Here's the land. It's the land of Israel. After the conquest, children of Israel go in. They take over the land. We start reading about the land of Israel. And that comes from the descendants of Jacob, who was called Israel. Okay, so that's where we get this. Palestine. Later we hear it, we talk about Palestine. Now we're more in the New Testament era. And really that's the name, as I understand, that's the name that was given to it by the Roman Empire. That's what they called it, was Palestine. Well, today it's called Israel. that same land is called Israel. And so those who would call themselves of Israeli descent, when this goes back to 1948, UN Council meeting recognized once again a country of Israel. Now look, that's not the same Israel as we're talking about now in Joshua chapter 1. And here's just a little point that has to be made with that. Because there's a lot of confusion in the religious world in this regard. People talk about Israel today. They may be talking about the country there in the Middle East that sits on the same piece of property as Joshua's about to lead the children of Israel onto. It's the same place, but it's not the same people. You see, those that God was leading through Joshua into the land, those were his people, his covenant people. He had a relationship with them. But when we talk about Israel today, we're not talking about the same relationship with God. In fact, that covenant isn't even there. That covenant went out a long time ago. And so it's called Israel, but we shouldn't confuse that as thinking about the same people that we're studying about in the book of Joshua now and going forward. But these are some of the names that we would be familiar with when we think about the land that they are entering into. Let's read just a little bit. Let's and again, we're talking about now, we're trying to focus on the geography of the land and trying to get a picture of some of this in our mind. We're in the book of Deuteronomy. We're backing up some. Let's go back to chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. This is the land that God had promised that would be rich and fertile. It's the land that the spies came out saying was flowed with milk and honey in the book of Numbers. But here in Deuteronomy, this is Moses speaking again to his people. Chapter 8, verse 7. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and pools of water, with springs flowing in the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, olive oil and honey. Well, man, that sounds all right. I mean, that sounds real nice. So this is the way it's described. This is what God has promised to the children of Israel. He's saying, this is what I'm giving you. Everything about that is like incredible. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 10, we will begin. The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt, from which you came, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are continually on it from the beginning of the year to its end. Wow. I mean, just think about that for a minute. Every time I read that passage, this is a land that the Lord your God takes care of. What do you think of? I'll tell you what I think of. What do you think of anything? It's a land that the Lord your God takes care of. Eden. That's what I think. I think about the Garden of Eden. I'm not saying it's the same. But I'm just making the point that, God is taking care of this land. This is special. And he's giving it to these people. God promises that this is going to be good. Verse 13. So if, that big little word comes up a lot in Scripture. If. So there's a contingency here, I know I don't need your help today, hon. Sometimes I say things and this lady in my phone starts talking to me. It's the weirdest thing, and it kind of scares me to death. All right, let's read a little bit more. Verse 13. So if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine and oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. I mean, the description again is just incredible. And the promise of God here is just amazing. Now, there was that if we talked about, okay? I read a little farther here, verse 16. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will produce no fruit, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is giving you. And it's a little bit to me like, Moses is saying, don't mess this up. I mean, this is so good what God is. Don't mess it up. And he warns them, you're going to be tempted. There's going to be people that follow other gods, and they're going to try to get you to follow their gods too. Don't do it. Because these promises that God made of plenty, God also promised that if you don't obey me, here's the consequence. And it was just as much a promise as the other. And so here's what God is saying to them. So, remember just recently, led you through Deuteronomy 27 and 28. The blessings and the curses, remember? And it was 2 chapters and a little bit more of that, of just being reminded, obey God and things will be good. Disobey and you will be cursed. And you know what? We're going to see both. As we go forward in this story, we're going to see some of both as we read on. Okay, back to the land. Back to the land here for just a few minutes. To try to get a picture in our mind of where we're going. I mean, look, you've seen maps of Israel forever, right? We're somewhat familiar with that. But sometimes we think of Israel as being a lot bigger than what it is. It's actually a very small country. It's about the size of New Jersey, if that gives us a little perspective of some things. So it's not very big. It's about 150 miles from the very tip top to the very bottom of the Negev, which we don't really spend a lot of time down there even. 150 miles. So it's about, from this church building to downtown Atlanta, it's 155 miles. So that's the whole country of Israel, the length of it. And of course, it's not near that wide. Up toward the top of it up here, you get up here, and it's only about 30 miles wide. And at the widest point down here, about 55 miles wide. And so if you fly into Tel Aviv over here on the coastline and get on a bus, in an hour you're in downtown Jerusalem. You're almost to the other side of Israel at that point. Just perspective. And so much of the Bible story going from here forward, and for sure the days of Jesus, is in this little piece of real estate. And as small as it is, this is what is just so interesting and amazing to me. As small as that piece of real estate is, everybody knows about Israel. Think about that. I mean, almost everybody, given a map, could probably point out where Israel is at. There's a whole bunch of countries that you mentioned, and I might say, well, yeah, I've heard of that. Where's it at? It's on this globe somewhere, is what I can tell you, but I can't tell you where. But you see, for such a little country, it is amazing the humongous role it has played in the history of mankind. And so, perspective, just putting some of these things together, and maybe this is just going too far here. I mean, on the west side, the boundary, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea. And on the north, you come up here like to the Lebanon Mountains. Here's Mount Hermon. We'll be talking about that soon. Mount Hermon and the Lebanon Mountains. The Lebanon Mountains. Is there anything that stands out about the Lebanon Mountains? Anything precious that comes from there? Cedar trees, There's still a few there, but a long time ago, maybe it was in building that temple. So many cedar trees were floated down the rivers to Jerusalem in building Solomon's temple, if you recall. But there were some very large cedar trees that were of some value. It's one of those things we put in the back of our mind. And then we're down here to the Negev. Some translation says Negeb, but most say Negev with a V down here on the bottom. And really it kind of comes on down in here. And then on the east side, the Arabian desert. Well, really and truly, it's the Jordan River, but just the other side of that is the Arabian desert. And so again, we see those boundaries kind of set up for us. I thought this was kind of an interesting picture, and we may not get through this here. We've only got a minute or so left. But I want us to, this is a topographical map, which is not the best map, but it's the best I can find of this kind, that helps us to see like the coastal plains, the lower areas, and then the mountain areas in the Central Hill District and stuff like that. And I want us to talk about that some more on Wednesday night, just trying to get a picture in our mind of the topography of this small country, because that comes into play in a lot of instances in events that are taking place. And even today, when you go to the country, there's some very different lifestyles from one region to another. Here we talk about regions. We're in the southwest region. We talk about the northeast region of our country, which is hundreds of miles away. Over there, we're talking about another region, just off the hill down there in the plain. Perspective. I want us to talk about that some more. So, in your book, follow that syllabus, do a little bit of reading. God willing, we'll take off right here on Wednesday night.